I was actually sat in Meadowhall when I first came across the Shroud of Turin, and I was just struck by the image, the face. It didn't look like an artwork, it looked like a real image. I just remember reading, a lot of people thought it was Leonardo da Vinci, so I just assumed, that was that. But I kept coming back to the image, because I took the magazine home with me. I was going through a really rough patch in my life, actually. I was just feeling really down. I had Jaws of Clay playing on in background, and it was a song called Silent. And as this song was playing, the magazine just dropped on the floor, and it had opened up to the actual face of Jesus on the Shroud of Turin. I just had this flood of emotions, and it's like Jesus just gave me this desire for the lost. So I just felt his love, this compassion, which I'd never felt for. And it just took my situation and just made it completely irrelevant, because I saw this love for what Jesus had for the lost, and I just burst into tears.
Well, hello and welcome to the Tinfoil Hat Club. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Ben.
And thank you for joining us yet again. Well, it is a special day on the foil today. We have not one but two guests, but one topic. So I've been looking forward to this one for a while. So
me too.
This one's a fascinating discussion. We're going to discuss today the Shroud of Turin. So some of you may know what that is and some of you may not. But we're going to get into that today because it is the burial cloth, or the supposed burial cloth that we read about in the Bible that Jesus was wrapped in. And so we're going to get into this today. We're going to talk about the evidence that people have tried to present that says it's not, and then a lot of the evidence that points to the fact that it very well could be Christ's burial cloth. But joining us today, our special guests, we have both Tony Cunliffe, and he is actually a Christian author and speaker, and he's very enthusiastic about the Shroud. And he has a booklet actually that he's put together, an ebook that he's put together on the Shroud. He was kind enough to send me a copy of that, which is phenomenal. And then he also has some printed literature that would be the same. And I guess we'll just kind of cover it now. What is a good website, Tony, for them to actually go to get that information?
I don't know whether you can see it on the screen there.
Yeah, that's great. So tony-cunliffe.square.site. And we will include that information too when we actually put this out for everybody. So they'll have an opportunity to get that. So perfect. And also joining us, you guys might have seen some stuff about this gentleman. I think on TikTok would probably be his biggest platform, but he's out there on all kinds of stuff, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and probably everything else under the sun. It is actually Paul Hanson. So, Paul, thanks so much, man. I appreciate you guys both joining us today, and looking forward to this conversation, man.
Yeah, looking forward to it, yes.
Yeah, so if people want to find you, what's the best place that you would like to send them to?
It's probably TikTok, but I'm mainly on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. YouTube, I've only got about 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, but on TikTok it's like over 70,000.
Wow.
So,
there's a part of me right now that wants to tell you to shut up.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome, brother. Wow, that is awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is, man. That's a lot of eyes that are going to get on your stuff that will help lead people to Christ, because obviously all these discussions really revolve around leading people to Christ, right? That's what matters. Mm-hmm. All right, so we kind of talked about everything before we hit record, and I guess for those that do not know what the Shroud of Turin is, let's start there, and let's just start a little bit with you guys, and whoever wants to go first, and how long you've kind of been digging into this, and what the Shroud is. So I'll let you guys kick it off, whoever wants to go.
Well, if I can maybe just tell you my backstory of how I got involved in the Shroud. It's not that long ago, actually. And it all started on a Sunday morning. I was out for a walk with a close friend of mine called David, and the conversation went something like this. He told me that on the previous Friday, he'd been to an atheist convention, and the atheist convention was entitled "The Evidence That There Is No God." And David, being a very sort of, he's an intellectual, no doubt, he thought he'd go along to check out what the evidence was that there is no God. And he wasn't very impressed by what he found. And also, he felt that a lot of the presenters weren't very complimentary about religious beliefs, and in particular Christianity. And in fact, one speaker said, believing in Christianity is a bit like believing that there's leprechauns or fairies at the bottom of your garden. And David thought to himself, and he thought, well, how can they prove that there aren't any fairies or leprechauns at the bottom of my garden? And then almost instantaneously, he said to me, Tony, have you ever heard of the Shroud of Turin? And when I thought for a moment, now, I've been a Christian all my life and actually was brought up in the Catholic Church. But when I look back, I didn't really know that much about it. And he told me about this faint image on this mysterious cloth that science just couldn't prove how it got there. And he talked to me about some radiation experiments that he'd seen on a YouTube channel some time ago. And I know it sounds a bit corny, but that's really what sparked my interest in the Shroud of Turin. And one of the things that struck me straight away was I imagined or remembered the shroud to be a face image, which is something that Paul will no doubt be focusing on later on as he tells us about his work. And I actually had that in mind, really. But one of the first things I found out about it is the cloth is around about 14 foot long by 3 foot, nearly 4 foot wide. And that really surprised me straight away that that's what it was. And as you said before, that there are many people out there that believe that the Shroud of Turin is the actual burial cloth of Jesus from the Bible. But as I think we're going to allude to as well, there's been a lot of controversy over the years about it, really. So I think the first thing to say is that it's a very, it was a very expensive piece of cloth that now resides clearly in the St. John's Chapel in Turin.
Yeah. Paul, go right ahead and give us kind of how you got on this train.
Yeah, so I was actually sat in Meadowhall when I first came across the Shroud of Turin. Meadowhall is in Sheffield. It's like a shopping complex. I don't know what they call them over your end. But
like a mall.
I just sat there and mall.
Yeah.
So I got it from the news agency, and I just sat there reading it while I was just having my dinner. And I was just struck by the image, the face. I mean, to me, it didn't look like an artwork. It looked like a real image. It looked like someone had just taken a photograph. I just remember reading it that a lot of people thought it was Leonardo da Vinci. So I just assumed, that was that.
Yeah.
Leonardo, that were it. It's done. So I just left it at that. But I kept coming back to the image because I took the magazine home with me. And I was going through a really rough patch in my life, actually. I just split up with a girlfriend. So kind of like, I was feeling a bit suicidal, actually. I had some suicidal thoughts. I didn't actually go and try it or attempt it or anything like that, but I was just feeling really down. And the funny thing was, I had Jaws of Clay playing it on in background, and it was a song called Silence by Jaws of Clay, and this song were playing on. And as this song were playing, the magazine just dropped on the floor, and it had opened up to the actual face of Jesus, the face on the Shroud of Turin. And I can't describe what happened next, because it was just like overwhelming. The feelings and everything. It was like at that point I just knew, because in the song it was saying, "Where are you?" as opposed to asking God the question. And the actual song was playing, and I just had this flood of emotions, and it's like Jesus just gave me this desire for the lost. So I just felt his love, this compassion, which I'd never felt for. And it just took my situation and just made it completely irrelevant, because I saw, this love for what Jesus had for the lost. And I just burst into tears. And that was it. That was my spiritual connection to the Shroud of Turin then. And then after then, it took about another 15 years. So that was probably back in 2003. And then back around 2014, 15, I started really delving deep into Shroud of Turin and looking at all the scientific evidence and everything. One thing I did realise was which, quite astonishing, was that the evidence supported the fact that it is authentic. I expected to be more evidence that it wasn't, but there were actually more evidence that it was authentic. And obviously the evidence that isn't authentic, there were a lot of questions around, like they dated the cloth back in the 1980s, and they put it in, I think it was Nature magazine they put it in, or what it Nature, anyway. They published it in a magazine only about 3 or 4 months after they published the date on the news. And they said it was from 1260 to 1390. Now, for a lot of people, they just thought, that proves it's a fake. But what people didn't realise is they actually held back the raw data until 2018, when the raw data was forced to be released by the UK Freedom of Information Act. They released the information, and scientists looked at the raw data, and there's been 2 scientific papers wrote since on it, saying that this should have never been published at all. So they shouldn't have really published it back in the 1980s.
Yeah.
I think they published it in 1987, I think it was.
Yeah.
And it just showed that the data was ambiguous. The dates were all over the place. Some dates were like sparse, from anything from 760 to 15th, 16th century. So there were a lot of dates out, and they found that it changed by about 200 years every 2 centimeters on the Shroud of Turin.
Wow.
So really, that's been made invalid, that dating test. But that was the nail in the coffin, really, at that time.
Paul's mentioned his experience there. I'm not somebody who particularly says that and God spoke to me, but I definitely believe every now and then he gives me a nudge. That's the way I look at it. And when I had that conversation with my friend David, I just really got stuck into doing some research into the Shroud, and found out things that we'll talk about. There's at least 6 mysteries on the Shroud. We've just basically covered one of them at the moment. There's 6 distinct different mysteries that we need to have a look at, really. But one of the first things I did, a little bit like we're doing now, I actually found a YouTube presenter called Guy Powell. And Guy's probably interviewed anyone and everyone that's been connected with the Shroud over the years, and has produced an excellent book on the Shroud called The One Witness. And I watched a program that he was doing with a guy called Michael Kowalski. And Michael Kowalski was very much involved with basically what Paul's been talking about, refuting the carbon dating and, kicking it into touch completely. And when I watched the program, something said to me, you need to contact Michael Kowalski. Now, I sent him an email, and it turns out he lives quite close to me. And Michael has become a good friend, and he's actually written the foreword for my illustrated booklet. So he became my technical advisor. So that was one thing. And then, bizarrely, one of the videos I watched was by a Catholic priest called Father Eamon Kelly. And he was basically based at that point in Jerusalem. And there's a museum there that's a permanent museum to the Shroud. So he was basically showing folk around his museum. And again, I watched this tour that he did, and I got another nudge, you better contact Father Eamon Kelly. And when I contacted him to congratulate him on the video that I'd watched, he said to me, "What video?" And it turned out that what I was watching was recorded 12 years earlier and had only just been put up onto YouTube. Anyway, the end result of that sort of contact was Father Eamon has also done a foreword for my book, and was very, very supportive in in the work I was doing, and has shared the booklet with, people within the Catholic Church who are considered to be experts on it. So, it's just amazing how God works. And I think sometimes we don't always stop and recognize what's going on. And the fact that I'm sat here now, I mean, I didn't know Paul. I think we've known each other for just over 2 months, my friend. And again, it was on Facebook that I noticed Paul's work. And I got the nudge, and the nudge was, you better get hold of Paul. Anyway, it turns out that we don't live that far away from each other either. So we had a coffee together probably less than 2 months ago. And then we've got this collaboration going, and that's resulted in the two of us sharing this platform with you today. So clearly God is at work in all this. And I think to sort of balance up the carbon dating, I think we need to go back to 1978 when there was the Sturp investigation. This is where I think, depending on which numbers you look at, between 30 and 40 American scientists actually went to Turin and spent nearly 5 consecutive days studying the shroud. They were given permission to do that. And the end result of all their work, it took about 3 years, I think, to actually announce the results, because their brief wasn't to see whether the shroud is authentic or not. And what the brief was to try and find out how this image got on the cloth, which is this superficial image that we will be talking about, which is on the top 1% of the fibers. How did it get there? And their conclusion was most definitely it was not the work of human hands.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in 1978, 1981. That would have been great for the shroudies of the time. And then bringing it back to what Paul's commented on about 1988. Clearly, that must have been a real blow when, the British Museum, and it was a headline news in English newspapers that it was a medieval fraud, apparently. Somebody had faked it up and flogged it off. That was the quote in the newspaper at the time. Today, nobody's been able to show how it was faked up. There's actually nobody been able to repeat in any way the image on that cloth.
Yeah.
There's actually a BBC filmmaker, and he's offered $1 million for anyone who can replicate the image with the same characteristics. And so no one's rose to the challenge.
David Rolfe.
Isn't it a 3D image?
Because it just cannot be done. That's actually what got them all interested in the first place back in the late 70s. The fact that it's a 3D image, so it's more like an hologram, but the information is it's like a dotted image.
Yeah.
So only way to describe it is like the fibrils is actually part of the image. So the elements of the fibrils have changed, and it's just right on the top layer of the fibrils, you've got all these dots. Now, on a normal photograph or a drawing, it's usually shades, so you get darker and lighter shades. With the Shroud of Turin, it's all the same colour, exactly the same shading all the way through. And the reason why it looks lighter and darker in certain parts of the shroud is because it's an actual dotted image. What do they call it? Aerial density image. So
I think as well, I mean, we've talked about the superficial image, but let's look at the cloth itself and what's on it. So the superficial image is obviously what we've just been discussing there. But what is on it is what appears to be evidence of a man who has been crucified in quite graphic detail. There are blood stains, there are scourge marks, all over the cloth, which correlate exactly to what you would have expected to be seeing, for somebody who had been crucified. And there are blood, back to the researchers of the Sturp project. There's human blood on the shroud. And also, if we were to look at it, we haven't obviously got an image with us today. The shroud was actually damaged in 1532. There was a fire. It was in a chapel in France at the time, and it's, I suppose, in a way, miraculously, it survived. But there are 16 burn holes up and down the cloth, which came about because of that fire. And there's actually water stains on it because clearly they had to try and put the fire out. But most of the image, miraculously, I'll use the word again, is still retained there.
I believe I'm right, but you have a behind you in your image. You actually have a copy of the shroud back there. Isn't that what that is? I see hanging behind you.
Yeah. So where my pen is pointing to is the hat. So what we should recognize here is where I'm pointing now is the front of the man, but the top here is the back of the man.
Have you got an image of it in your booklet?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
You could show.
Yeah, and I'll make sure too, for those of you that are listening and not watching, you might want to go to the tfhc.com and actually watch this one because we're going to have some visual aids. I'm going to drop in some good photos too of the X-ray imaging, so everybody can see. But yeah, you can clearly see, especially when you run a negative on the photo, the image just absolutely bursts off the page at you.
Well, what is really amazing, and I think you can gloss over this, that we're looking at the front and the back.
Mm-hmm.
How on earth did that happen? Have you guys ever come across a camera where you take the front and back image of a person at the same time? It doesn't exist.
Right.
Here we have an image on a clock, front and back. It's almost impossible to understand that.
The back actually matches up with the front, perfectly. So it's like
exactly.
I think what they determined was that it wrapped a real body.
Yeah,
that's what they determined back in the early 80s.
Wasn't
all them scientists said it was, and that's correct.
Wasn't how the image is? Wasn't it almost it was sort of levitated when the image was made? If I remember seeing something right, it was almost like it was like lifted up.
Yeah, they've wrote a few scientific papers on it where they can tell just from the air that the man was vertical when the image was taken. But he's also got his feet. He's got his feet like that vertically.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not standing.
Yeah.
He's actually got his feet like in the crucifixion position. As though he's got one behind the other. The actual back of the shroud, there's no compression marks on the skin. I mean, it's so detailed.
Yeah.
When you really look at it, there's no compression marks to show that he was laying down at all. So the man himself was either, in a state of where there's no gravity, or, it was just upright.
We'll get you back to the show in just a second, but I wanted to share with you how you can help support The Foil. First, head on over to our website, thetfhc.com, and click on the Support The Foil button. This is actually going to take you to the page that'll tell you the 4 ways that you can help support The Foil. The first way that you can support The Foil is becoming a member of the show. There are 2 different membership levels, starting at just $5 a month. Number 2 is you can just give directly to The Foil via the Cash App. Scan the QR code on your phone with your camera, and you can give directly to the show. 3, head on over to the merch store and buy some merch. And 4, anytime you want to buy one of our guest books, head over to the guest page, thetfhc.com/guests, and purchase the books through our website. A portion of the proceeds actually comes back to support the show. Thanks so much. Back to the show. Before we go any further on some of the data, what I would like to do, again, just for those that maybe are not as familiar with things as the 4 of us, and I'm the least familiar of the 4 of us, just historically, let's walk back to kind of the beginning, because we obviously see in the Bible that the cloths were set to the side, right? And we can read these in the Gospels. What is the first time that these cloths reappear in history that we are aware of, and where?
Right. Well, there's a probable historical trail, which again I cover, and if we obviously say that the journey of the cloth started in Jerusalem, 30 to 33 AD, which is fairly self-evident. So the question is, what happened after that?
Yeah.
Now, there is a story, and it's in no way, there's no evidence of this in the Bible. And it's the legend of King Abgar of Edessa. And the Bible says that the news about Jesus spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various sicknesses, and he healed them. Now, King Abgar, who had leprosy, sent a messenger to find Jesus and ask him if he would come and heal the king. And Jesus told the messenger he had other priorities, but would send someone later to bring healing to the king and his family. Now, it is thought the Apostle Jude took a cloth with a mysterious image on it to Edessa. Abgar was healed of leprosy and became a believer, and he eventually dies of natural causes. And then his second son, Manu, took over the throne, didn't like Christianity, and so his kingdom resorted to paganism. So we reckon that the shroud was in Edessa from between 200 and 944 AD. I won't go into the full details, but the history says that it probably went from there to Constantinople from about 944 to 1204. Then in 1204, we had the Crusades, the Fourth Crusade, and it's believed that the shroud disappeared around about that time and seemed to reappear in Chambéry in France in about 1502. And the story goes there that they think that a French knight basically got hold of the shroud, the cloth. But the Pope had said that anybody who steals any religious relics would be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. So that's a plausible explanation as to why the cloth seemed to disappear until 1502. And then we could say that there's absolute historical evidence from 1502 all the way through to 1578 when the cloth ended up in Turin. We can say that. But the journey that I've described isn't conclusively historical, but it's probably the best guess that we can give.
Yeah.
I think if we back up a bit and go to where first mentioned in Edessa, there are some scripture elements about the Shroud of Turin that where the scriptures actually sort of like allude to it. There's, I think, 3 Galatians 1. Paul's writing to the Galatians, and he actually says, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who has deceived you from the truth, whose eyes saw the portrayal of Jesus Christ crucified." So that, to me, scholars have struggled with that for many years because it's actually, the actual Greek word is like portrayal. It's like showing him something of Jesus Christ being crucified. And it was that powerful, this thing what he showed him, that it was absolutely couldn't understand how they could stray from the truth.
Yeah.
So that's one mentioned in the scriptures. When you come to Edessa, they were actually called the Mandylion. So another word for it was called the Mandylion. And all we know about the cloth of Edessa was it was like a face cloth. So they must have folded the shroud up at some point.
Absolutely.
And there are fold marks in the shroud. You can see this.
Yeah.
But Paul did use a word in the scriptures called, and I think I'm not the only person who's discovered this, but I discovered something new about it. It was the actual Greek word, mandylion. Paul used it. It actually means cloak. There's no, the word that Paul used was not actually a Greek word used at the time. So it's not found in ancient Greek. So the word he used was like a code word for a cloak. I think it's 2 Timothy 4. I think it says it in. It says, "Bring my cloak from Troas."
Yep.
But that word, mandylion, is actually a very similar word bishops then used later, and then they called the cloth of Edessa mandylion, which was the more or less very similar word. So whether it's the same cloth,
Yeah.
it's a bit of speculation. But
And when was the fire again?
1532.
Okay.
So that was in Chambéry, France.
And now the cloak
in
was
Chambéry,
folded at that
France.
particular time.
But
That's why
also-
the burn and the watermarks are all uniform, right? Because the cloak was
Yes.
folded.
Yes.
And I think it was
in a
actually
silver
kept
cup.
in like
It
a...
was in a silver
Yes.
The silver box, yeah.
Yeah, and the silver dripped onto the cloth, right? And that's how it gets the
Silver.
marks.
cup. But also in this time period, particularly in France, the shroud would have been on display many, many times, and we've alluded to the carbon dating and etc. But the cloth that was tested in 1988, the part of the cloth that was tested had probably been held by hundreds, if not thousands of people over the years in that very corner,
Right.
where the sample was taken, so
Yeah.
because it was on display. There's lots of paintings of the shroud on display, I think somewhere, hundreds and hundreds of times across the way, really.
I think it was it Joe Marino and his wife that they found out that the actual edge of the cloth looked more like an invisible reweave from France. So it looked like it had been stitched back on invisibly. And I think Ray Rogers, he denied it. He was one of the scientists that worked on the shroud in the 80s and late 70s. And he denied their claims until he took out the sample he'd already got, because he got a sample of it. He found mannaroot dye in it and things like that. So that confirmed the theory. He also found cotton
That's right.
as well.
Yeah,
But it seems like a part of the shroud, that corner, had been prepared in the past.
Yeah.
And obviously that's one of the things that skew the dates as well.
Another characteristic of the mystery, let's call it a mystery, is the fact that the shroud is best viewed from a distance. Now, the shroud is not on display to the public and hasn't been for quite some time. 2015, I think, was the last time.
I think they showed it during COVID, actually.
Of course.
They did show it during COVID, only televised.
Of course.
Okay.
I remember watching it. I watched it on
Right, but if you were present at the viewing then to see it, apparently it's best viewed from about 6 foot away. And apparently the closer you get to it, the less of the image that you can actually see on it, which again is amazing. Unlike a photograph, because it's the opposite. If with a photograph or a painting even, the closer you get, the more detail you will see. But the shroud is totally different. The closer you get, the less that you will see. And
I think it's something like 6 foot, where you get up to 6 foot.
that's it.
If you get closer than 6 foot, it just disappears. The image just vanishes.
And then
And it also vanishes under a backing light. So when they shine the backing light back of the image, it also disappears. Sorry.
And I think the other thing you mentioned earlier was about the image, about the photographic negative, which is there displayed there.
Yes.
This is in 1898. There was a Seconda took the first photograph of the shroud, and when he processed it and developed it, this is what happened. So the negative looks much clearer than the shroud cloth itself. So to think that back in that this cloth could have a photographic negative quality again is just, that is another amazing mystery. How this cloth could actually have that situation. The other thing about the cloth as well is that we talked about the blood stains. Well, the blood stains on the cloth are bright red. Now, with blood stains, in most cases, blood turns either to brown or to black.
Yeah.
But it's gone bright red, and that's because of an element called bilirubin, which when a person's had a real physical trauma, such as a crucifixion, the blood is left in such a way that it remains bright red. So that's another mystery that's there. And in fact, I would say a confirmation that clearly the body on this cloth had been crucified. And then I think one more thing to mention, which we'll come to later, that there, on the cloth itself, there are no stains of decomposition. So if you think about it for a moment, a body that's been, a dead body that's been wrapped in a cloth, if it was there for even a short period of time, the body would start to decompose, and water, blood, would start to seep out of the body and clearly discolor the cloth. This cloth has no stains of decomposition. So that tells us if a body was in the cloth, it wasn't there for very long.
It's not as though they can wrapped it either, because they can check the blood. I mean, scientists have looked at the blood and they've found that there's no marks of where it's cracked or anything like that. Whereas if they'd have just took the body off the cloth within 72 hours, there should have been some marks and there should have been cracking of the blood. Yeah. But there's none of that. It's like the body just vanished. Yeah. So that's another mystery. I think one of the biggest mysteries to me is like when they dated the cloth, after they dated it to the medieval times, the British, the guy who did the dating and everything, and the British Museum received $1 million. So like a backhanded
hush money.
$1 million.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, very much.
That's a great way to pollute the science pretty fast, isn't it?
So, I mean, some people wanted that in the first place. I think they aim for that.
Yeah, go figure. Ben, you had a question real quick. I just let you.
Oh, I was going to say, isn't it one continuous piece of linen, like woven together?
Yes, herringbone weave. Yeah.
Yes. And the pieces that, like going back to, we'll say if it's the time of Christ, then they would have not mixed any kind of two separate pieces of cloth. Like they wouldn't put cotton or with lint. I mean, they would have mixed that. So the fact that they did a hidden seam on it was pretty good.
When it was put on, just to make sure I'm understanding right, because it is 14 feet long and 4 feet wide, when it was put on Christ, it was actually basically the center point at the 7 foot mark would have been put on Christ at the top of his head and then draped over both sides, right? So you're going to have 7 feet on the front and 7 feet on the back, roughly. Is that correct, how it was put on?
They do believe that Sally was wrapped up. I mean, the Gospels, I think it's Gospel Marcos, or one of the Gospels say the shroud, which they use the Greek word syndon, which means shroud, was wrapped over the body. So they just wrapped over the shroud over the body. But scientists do believe that they tied it up as well, using there's like a side panel down the cloth that's being cut off and then resewn on, back on. Now this side panel, they've looked at the stitch pattern when it was being renovated back in the early 2000s, and a textile expert said that it almost matched the stitch pattern of Masada 1st century. So they got a piece of cloth from Masada 1st century and it matched that particular stitch pattern, which obviously puts it back in the 1st century.
Obviously, we're aware from the Bible that the cloth belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. It wasn't originally meant for Jesus. It was meant for Joseph of Arimathea, who was clearly a very wealthy man. So he'd basically ordered and had produced a very expensive cloth, which is back to this herringbone weave. And I think it was based on some Egyptian weaving technique. I think if you go back into the history, there was a certain type of weave that was produced along the way, which presumably only was available to those who had plenty of money at the time, which obviously Joseph clearly did. I think the other thing about the way that the cloth was sort of Good Friday, there was a bit of haste, as again we might just touch on it in a bit more detail in a moment. It wasn't the complete burial because, of the Passover. So it was a bit of I'm going to say a rush job, but it was really. So And that's why on the Sunday morning that the women actually had gone back to finish the job, if you like. So, the actual burial cloth was not a complete covering, as it would have been later.
I think a lot of objections, a lot of Christians have a lot of objections, and one of them is that Jesus would have been covered with a face cloth, and it mentions the face cloth, but where's the face cloth? And I don't know whether you have you guys heard of the Sudarium of Oviedo?
Yeah, I was getting ready to ask that question.
Yeah, I had some questions too about the face cloth as well, how that would have been applied, and where is it now, and some of that as well. So, good job. You're getting us. You got us there early.
Who has it now?
Sudarium of Oviedo. Well, it's actually in Spain. It's in Oviedo. And just going back to the face cloth, it's my understanding that when Jesus was brought down from the cross, remember that the burial would have been a typical Jewish burial at the time. And my understanding is that the face would have been immediately covered, because it was Jewish tradition that they didn't want any sort of any leakage from a body. They wanted to bury everything, because bodies decompose quite quickly, as we just mentioned before. So I think if we imagine that this was a face covering over Jesus as they brought him down from the cross and took him to the tomb, but the accounts on Easter Sunday morning says that there was a face cloth was actually seen to be wrapped up and somewhere separate. So that's why we reckon that cloth is, as Paul was saying, the Sudarium of Oviedo, which actually directly matches a lot of the bodily fluids and the blood stains on the shroud. So that face cloth was not buried with Jesus. It was separate. It was a separate thing that was only there for that period of time of bringing him down from the cross, taking him to the tomb.
And they found like limestone dirt on both cloths. So they found dirt from Jerusalem on both cloths, limestone dirt.
Yeah.
They found like myrrh and aloes, the same myrrh and aloes signature on both cloths as well. And obviously the same type of blood patterns on both cloths. So like a forensic link to the Shroud, the Sudarium.
Yeah. And
the Sudarium actually goes back, it's got a documented history back to the 6th century Jerusalem.
Yes.
So, if people want to say that the Shroud is a medieval forgery, they've got to explain, how is it a forensic link to this cloth? And it we proved in a court of law. How is it a forensic link to this head cloth? It goes back to the 6th century.
Isn't the blood pattern on the one that was over his head similar to that what was on the shroud, if I remember right?
Yeah, they match it up by it's 120 congruence point congruence.
Yeah.
So they've matched it up, and I think typically to match a face up in a court of law, it takes about 50 or 60 points of congruence, but they matched it up with 120.
Yeah, wow.
So it's so they are saying it's just, almost the same man.
We can cover this point now if we like. So if we go to the Crucifixion and Good Friday, my view is that the Apostle John, well, we know he was present at the Crucifixion. We know he was there. So if we think about it for a moment, somebody had to bring Jesus down from the cross and carry the body to the tomb. That was probably Joseph of Arimathea, one or two, maybe Nicodemus, I'm not sure. But I would suggest John was probably present and probably helped carry the body. And therefore, if he carried the body from the cross to the tomb, he was probably present when they actually put the burial cloths over the dead body of Jesus on Good Friday. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Would you go along with that? Okay, so then obviously the stone is put over the tomb, and off they go, and then we know the story on Easter Sunday morning that Mary Magdalene, arrives. I won't go over the full story, but I think we know it quite well. However, the first two apostles to come to the tomb, as again you'll probably know, were Peter and John. And John got there first, but in deference to Peter, he let Peter go in first. And then there's a line in scripture that says, and John looked in and he believed. Now, I think what John saw was the burial cloths that he saw Jesus wrapped in, wrapped up like a cocoon with no body in it. The body had disappeared completely. And that really struck me when I was doing my research, that John looked in and he believed. So why would he believe? Because he would have seen something there. And he doesn't actually say that, you know, he doesn't mention the shroud directly. He does mention linens, etc. But I think that's quite a dramatic sort of part of the gospel that we don't always focus on.
Yeah, and it does say that the other disciples didn't know that Jesus arose from the dead at the time, and it was just John, the disciple who saw the linen cloths. And he does zone in on the linen cloths. He does say, you know, the linen cloths were lying there with the headcloth wrapped up to the side. And there is what's interesting is in this, I think it's either the 6th or 7th century, but it's quite early on. There's actually a Masorite text. It's like a vicar, you know, doing his sermon notes or whatever. And the priest that did it, he actually interjected the scriptures, and he put that John and when Peter and John ran to the tomb, they saw the linen cloths lying there and the imprints of the risen man on the cloths. So there is actually, early on, it shows that Christians knew that there was an imprint on the burial cloth of Jesus.
Hey everyone, we'll get you back to the show in just a minute, but I wanted to show you another way that you can actually help out myself and the show. Head on over to our website, thetfhc.com, and click on Pod U. This is actually going to take you to Podcast University. So if you or anyone you know has wanted to become a podcaster, this is going to be the perfect place for you. We actually have 10 different sessions available for you on here, both on demand, or you can actually book a live 1-hour session with me. Sessions cover things like how to set up your show so you don't become a statistic, equipment, recording, editing, distribution, marketing, guests, monetizing, how to understand your stats, and how to grow your podcast. You can head over to thetfhc.com/pod-u, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session. It seems like the first good forensic study of this was kind of where we started. So we're kind of back to that. Was done in that 78 time frame. Now, what all did they do during that forensic study? Well, I guess they weren't necessarily trying to prove or disprove. They just were doing a deep forensic study of everything. So what all did they do at that time?
Well, they were doing all sorts of measurements. So over 5 days, they performed photomicroscopy, easier for me to say, and many photographs were taken, including close-ups of the fabric at different levels of magnification, low energy X-radiography. I have to put my teeth back in, I think. Infrared thermograph imaging and reflectance spectrometry. Well, you did ask me to say what the site was. And these tests, let's go on, they can detect anything that might result from heat, trace organic elements, anything metallic or organic compounds. They also performed scanning photography from infrared to ultraviolet, particle analysis, blood analysis, and microchemical analysis. An enormous amount of data was gathered over 120 continuous hours. So I think, gentlemen, we could say it was a pretty thorough scientific research that was done.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is they found that there were pigments. There weren't enough pigments on the cloth to make the image.
Yeah.
which they were expecting. I think it was Barry Schwartz, who was a Jewish photographer on the team. He went and he were expecting just to find the pigments on the cloth, say it's a painting, and then go home. But they didn't. They found nothing.
It was a massive project as well. It's amazing, really, that the Vatican allowed them to do it, really. But there you go, they did. Also, I think one area we've not covered so far is that, so we had the controversy with the carbon dating, but of course, subsequently, there's been many other tests that have been done to actually prove that the shroud is clearly much older than the carbon dating results showed. So there's quite a number of different. Paul's mentioned one of them, which was dirt analysis. There was also pollen analysis and dirt analysis. So some of the limestone particles that are on, I think you mentioned on the Sudarium and on the shroud, can be traced back to the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem in the 1st century. And the pollen as well.
Wow.
There was a guy called Dr. Avenine Danine who wrote a book called The Botany of the Shroud, and he's also showing that there was pollen on the shroud that can only have come from a place in the Jerusalem area, again in the 1st century. So all sorts of different tests showing that along the way.
I think the biggest one was done in 2020, and that was X-ray spectrometry test.
Wide-angle X-ray scattering, Paul.
That's
Wide-angle X-ray scattering.
And they found that the date for that was between 35 to 74 AD, something like that. Yeah. But they've done 5 tests on the shroud. Vanillin test, where they check vanillin is like vanilla ice cream. Vanillin is actually part of vanillin ice cream. They don't actually make ice cream out of fabric, but they check the vanillin on the actual shroud, and vanillin dissipates. So after time, it starts to degrade and disappears. They found no vanillin on the shroud textile itself, which means it gives it a maximum age of, a minimal age of 1,500 years. And what's interesting is the sample they took to date the shroud back in the 80s, that does have vanillin on it. So whereas the shroud doesn't have vanillin, the corner piece, what they took the sample from, does have vanillin. So
now I think also, gentlemen, what we need to address is, can it be Jesus? This could be the shroud of anybody. So we need to look at what evidence there is out there that points. So yes, it was on the cloth was a crucified man. Well, many men were crucified at that time. So how can we actually establish that it is Jesus? And you'll be pleased to know that there are pointers to that. And one of them is the earliest images of Jesus. If you go back to, the catacombs, apparently, in the early days, Jesus was actually shown as like a bit of an Adonis sort of figure without a beard or looking quite a sprightly young chap. And it was only sort of around about the 6th century that we started to get this sort of image that many of you will be familiar with.
Yeah.
I don't know whether Paul wants to comment on this particular picture, because it fits nicely into what you were saying about the Mandylion and the face image.
Yeah, that's a coin image, isn't it? So,
that's right.
They found many coins back in, I think, 8th century, 9th century, 6th century, and they all bear striking resemblance to the Shroud of Turin face. Right. Some of them even got the mark. So, like, one coin has, on the shroud face, his right cheek is actually swollen and bruised. And there is actually a coin where he shows that, and the folk beard where his blood's been pulled out as well.
But there's also here, this is the fold mark. We've said already that the shroud for many years, and even in 1532, was folded. Well, in those early days, there's actually a fold mark on the shroud, which appears on the coin. It appears on the coin, which says that the person who did that mold must have actually seen the shroud image itself in order to do that. The mold, the guy did the cutting at that time. So that's around about 500 or 600. I think the other thing is that, going back to scripture, that it was unusual for a criminal to be flogged and crucified. What used to happen apparently is the Romans were quite good at dishing out punishment, but they would usually only flog someone close to death, but not to death, as an example. So that would normally happen. Or they would crucify a man. Now, usually if they crucified someone, that person was on the cross for several days. So yet here, in this situation, we have a man who was both flogged and crucified, which is most unusual. And I think another pointer to Jesus is also that usually criminals would end up in a pauper's or a common grave. But this particular criminal, Jesus, ended up in a tomb, buried in an expensive cloth. So again, this points towards Jesus. It's not one of the problems we have in all this is that we'll never ever be able to prove 100% it is Jesus in that cloth. Why?
We can certainly narrow it down, though.
But we can't prove it 100% because we don't have the DNA of Jesus. It's not to say it's not, but I'm just saying from that point of view, we don't. That's one thing we don't actually have available to us.
They have done computer models studying on the Shroud of Turin, and they found that the guy is actually Semitic. He's 85% Semitic. Yeah. So we know that he's a crucified Jew.
Yeah.
That's one thing we know about it. We also know from the hairstyle that it's likely to be a Nazarene. It's got the back, like Nazarene ponytail. So if you look at the back image of the shroud, you can see he's got like a ponytail on the back of the Shroud of Turin.
The other thing about the marks on the body and on the shroud is that we know, don't we, that in the case of Jesus and the thieves that were crucified with him, Jesus had already died, so the Romans didn't need to break his legs.
Mm-hmm.
So the image on the shroud, the legs are not broken. Also, we're aware that there was a spear put in Jesus' side, and out came blood and water. Now, that blood and water is actually on the shroud cloth in exactly the place you would expect it to be. Exactly the place you'd expect it to be.
Yeah, one of the things that I think also for me points to the fact that this is Christ is the crown of thorns, because that is not going to be a typical injury. More than likely not. I mean, you might get hit in the head while you're being scourged, but they're going to scourge you, and they're mainly going to hit your midsection, your torso, maybe some of your legs, maybe your arms, but they're typically not going to strike you in the face, right, or the head. And you can clearly see when you look where a lot of the injury from having the thorns pressed into his head would be, and it shows up on the shroud.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think they found the pollen across the head as well, where all the marks are. They found that it's come from a plant called Gundalea tourniforte, which is actually a plant native to Jerusalem, and it only blossoms in the spring. So,
what are the odds of that?
It's a coincidence.
Just a coincidence.
Sure, you've all come across Mel Gibson's film The Passion.
Yes.
And at the time, many people thought, the trail was totally unrealistic. It was over the top. Based on what we see on this track, it clearly wasn't. It was accurate.
Yeah.
Well, I think they found like 120 scourge marks back and front.
That's correct.
Of the shroud. And I think they've narrowed it down to being a typical dumbbell-shaped gauge wounds done by something similar to a Roman flagrum, what was found in 70 AD up near Masada. They found this Roman flagrum. I think it's in a museum somewhere. Is it in a Shroud museum, Tony? I think you mentioned it the other day. Something about the Roman flagrum, what they used on the Shroud. Matches the one in 70 AD.
I'm just looking for it. Yeah, I've got a show that was on there actually. Horrific.
It's in a museum.
Yeah,
as well.
that was. This is in the museum in Jerusalem actually. This one there.
I know one of the things that Ben always says that I never really thought about, which he's awesome for that because he just comes from a different place in his mind than I do. So it opens my eyes to a lot of stuff. I'm very thankful for him, which is the fact that Christ could have that happen, that could be scourged like that. And we know, I think, historically speaking, that a lot of times people would never make it to the cross. The Romans would literally scourge them to death. So between blood loss and shock, probably, people would literally never even make it there. And one of the things that Ben has always pointed out is the fact that after he's scourged, he's actually taken to Pilate and is able to have a completely coherent conversation. Just kind of speaks to the divinity of the moment to me, right? And to you, which is just unbelievable. So one of the things that I want to transition to now, if we could, is let's talk about, we've already kind of hinted at a few things where, the naysayers will point at stuff and go, nope, can't be the Shroud because this doesn't match up. And I know one of the things that I had, and I want to talk about this and I want to talk about some other things as well. What are some of the other big things out there that they tend to use other than what maybe we've already talked about as far as tearing the corner piece off and, obviously trying to run, carbon dating where everybody would have touched it? What are some of the other things that they typically use to try to say, no, this is a forgery and all of that?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that today because there's a guy called Russ Brio he's one of the foremost experts on the Shroud, and he's just actually published a new book. In fact, Russ was instrumental in my little booklet. I based it on one of his YouTube videos. And I was reading an opening chapter about several attempts to show how the Shroud was actually made by human hands. And I can't remember the detail of each one, but he went through a number of them. And a lot of it was trying to say that it could have been painted on. But one thing that I picked up, which I don't know whether Paul's come across this, that along the way, copies of the Shroud were actually done. I say copies, very poor quality copies were done. And apparently there was some sort of ritual that they used to put the copy cloth on the Shroud cloth. And that could result in some pigments or paint or something being transferred across. So there are some people out there saying, oh, yeah, well, there's evidence now that it was clearly painted. But each one of the attempts to sort of come up with an alternative just fails. And in fact, Paul mentioned earlier on about the David Rolfe situation. There just isn't a feasible explanation as to how the Shroud image came there. In fact, when I was doing research for my book, there's very little out there. The sort of things are anecdotal, so there'll be some folks who will say, oh, it's one of those Catholic relics. The Catholics, are famous for, selling off parts of the cross and all this lot. Right. And I actually do think that can be established, because if we say to folk, this is, an artifact, that's from the Catholic Church, straight away all people say, well, it must be a fake then, because all of those, they're full of all those situations, you see. So I think that's something we have to sort of find a way to. I think in today's world, from what I'm seeing, people across denominations seem more open to the story of the Shroud than maybe they were, because it's easy to be closed-minded and say, well, that's a Catholic thing, so that's down to the Catholic Church.
Right.
I think as well, like, they have found some red ochre paint on the shroud, but as Tony was saying, it's been transferred on there. But there's not nearly enough to cause the image, because even if you got all of that together into one spot, you'd still need a microscope to look at it. And also the image disappears under a backing light. So that proves that it wasn't paint, because it had shown up straight away under a backing light. It wasn't a burn or anything like that. It proves that, the image itself is so superficial that even UV light goes deeper than the actual image. So even if people want to say it's a photograph, it's not a photograph, because UV light actually goes deeper than 0.2 microns. So everything now, apart from particles. So I think some kind of particle energy, like a burst at the resurrection of Jesus, actually caused the image.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a burst of energy, and that's what caused the image.
I was going to say, in answer to the sort of general question about, what's out there to counter it, I think we have the world's greatest unsolved mystery.
Mm-hmm.
Because and I'm saying that because nobody's come out with anything in any way, shape or form to get close to it. So now my approach to this whole subject is I think I mentioned, I jokingly say I'm doing a world tour, but it's mainly in the northwest of England. And when I talked live to a group of people, I take the view that I want to invite them to join me in my investigation, and I want them to try and to keep an open mind as to what they think. And at the end of my presentation, I do a secret ballot where I invite the audience to vote whether they think it's authentic, a hoax, or in my case, something else. And so far, 55% are saying it's authentic, 10 or 12% a hoax, and 30-odd% are saying something else. Now, I take the view as well. I don't declare, even to Paul or to you, my good friends, whether I actually believe the Shroud of Turin is authentic or not. I think it suits my purpose to keep that balanced view along the way. What I want to do is encourage people to look at the story of the Shroud, because as we mentioned, I think before we got started, that one of my goals in writing my book and doing the talks is to share the gospel, the story of the passion, the crucifixion and the resurrection in a totally different way without coming down. So I don't want to actually declare to anyone that I believe the Shroud is authentic or not, because it in no way does that influence my own faith. So whether the Shroud is authentic or not, it wouldn't make any difference to me in terms of what I actually believe.
Amen.
I think it would be good. Paul started us on the sort of frame of looking at the possible explanation for the image. And I mean, and that's amazing. I mean, when we think about it, what we're actually saying now is that, I'm trying to keep it nice and short, that what could have caused the image was a massive burst of energy. And we're talking a massive burst of energy. Up to 32 billion watts in a very, very short period of time, in nanoseconds. That could have been what actually produced the image of the cloth. So what we're looking at is this massive burst of energy hitting that dead body in that cloth, causing the dead body, as Paul has actually said, basically to rise up and out of the cloth. And that is an explanation of what may have happened. We're not saying that is what happened, but we're saying we've looked at all the natural explanations. Now let's look at a supernatural explanation. So a supernatural explanation is the resurrection. And then it's for people who learn about the Shroud, read the books, come to the talks, for them to decide whether that has had an impact on them. And hopefully it has.
Yeah.
I think it's like it's like that famous quote from Sherlock Holmes where, he says, I can't remember the quote actually. Look, it's something about deducting. Have you got it? Yeah. So when you have eliminated, go on, you read it.
When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Yeah.
So we can say what the shroud isn't. Better than what we can say what the shroud is. And it's definitely not a painting, it's not a scorch, it's not burn.
My question would be, so based on what we've been chatting about today, I think we all have this passion that we'd like to get the story of the Shroud of Turin out there in some way. And Paul did an amazing job, with on TikTok and all that to do it, and got a tremendous number of followers, who follow what he's doing with, putting the image together, particularly the live image animation that he's doing as well. But how do we get beyond that group? How do we get beyond our group out there? Because sadly, evangelism, I don't know whether it's a dying art or whatever, but I'm always searching for ways within my own family and friends to tell the story of the gospel. And I really do believe that the story of the Shroud, if we can engage people as we've done this evening, actually discussing, talking about, checking it out, whatever, by definition, we're talking about, the story of the passion and the resurrection.
I think that's why the Lord left us this image on this cloth, as a sign of his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, as a sign to the world. I think it's like the sign of Jonah that Jesus speaks and alludes to, because it's got everything on there. It's got all the marks, it's got all the wounds, it's got the resurrected image. Everything's recorded on that cloth, like a crime investigation.
I think there's another question as well, which is to the Catholic Church, that, as I say, my information was that last public showing was in 2015, and there isn't any plans, as we know at the moment, for any future showings. Now, you would have thought logically, I used to be a financial planner and accountant in my career, and you would have thought logically that the Catholic Church would want to have the cloth retested, because 1978 was a long time ago, and you would anticipate that with scientific developments, whatever, there would be a case for it being re-examined, and then, but clearly they must have their own reasons for not allowing that to happen. And it just sounds it seems strange to me that there is no plan to actually show the cloth in the future. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't. But one of the popes, I forget which particular one, but I have seen a quote from one of the popes quite a few years ago, and he's basically saying, as I said earlier, that the story of the shroud is a mirror of the gospel. So that's where that, and the Catholic Church itself doesn't declare that the cloth is authentic. So I'm actually doing a talk to a Catholic church in a month's time. I'm guessing that the majority will probably believe it's authentic, but not every Roman Catholic that I meet believes it's authentic. And as we've said before, It doesn't really matter from a faith perspective whether it is or it isn't.
I think if we look at it from scientific consensus, there's no consensus, because although it is, if it were like a pharaoh or someone like that, I'm sure they'd say, oh yeah, it's that pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
We dug up, I remember watching a program where they dug up Richard III in England and it's barely got as much evidence that that's Richard III than the Shroud of Turin has evidence that it's Jesus. So, I think it's definitely authentic in my book. Because I think if you could take the evidence to, say a mock-up court case or something like that, the evidence is so overwhelming that, they'd undoubtedly rule in favour of it being Jesus.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I noticed from my presentations is that I always say at the beginning that I'd like you to keep an open mind. Whatever your beliefs, however you've come to this evening, to keep an open mind. But I recognise in life that's almost impossible, because we've all got a particular worldview. The four of us will have our own worldview now. And therefore, if you've got somebody who's 100% atheist, and one of my closest friends is exactly that, he will come along to my talk, convinced before I open my mouth that it's got to be a hoax or a fraud, because he's an atheist, and that's the difficulty. So I'm wondering, really, again, if we can find a younger audience who've never heard of it. I'd love to actually speak to a group of 30 or 40 young people who'd never heard of it at all, and go through what we've just been talking about now, and just get their sort of feedback as to what they think. Because most of the people I'm speaking to are retired and have already made up their mind, so so I think when they come to one of my talks, it's of interest to them, but maybe not going to have a dramatic effect. But I think with the younger people, and that's why I'm convinced actually what Paul is doing with the marketplace he's working in, he's tapping into that very age group that I think that Christianity is looking for, because we've got to engage with the younger people and find a way to do that. Well, I'm cracking on a bit now. I'm a bit older than you guys, so I'm running out of a bit of steam, but I'll keep on going as long as I can, sort of thing. But I feel as if I want to hand the baton over to somebody else to, hey, come on, let's get the message out there.
Right. Hey everyone, we'll get you back to the show in just a minute, but I wanted to share with you a great way that you can keep in the know on all things foil. Head on over to our website, thetfhc.com, and just wait for this green pop-up to appear. Fill out all that information in there and then click Keep Me Notified. What this is going to do is this is going to add you to our weekly newsletter. We're going to keep you updated on everything we have going on with the show, but you're also going to get some amazing perks in doing this. This is going to enable you to get access to our private fans Facebook group page, and also you're going to get an email for 20% off your first order in the merch store. So head over to the website, thetfhc.com, and fill this out today, and we're going to keep you updated on everything foil. And now, back to the show. Now, Ben, I know you had a question.
Yeah, what's that saying in England now?
Going back to the image, I was thinking about when Jesus asked, what's on your coin?
Oh yeah, give to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Yes, because the Jews weren't allowed to have any graven image, and it was Caesar's image on the coin, because no image of God was supposed to be made by man. There's only one person that can make the image of God, and that would be God himself. Yeah. So going through that logic, God created his own image to show that he was here. That's what I've always believed.
That's one of the objections from Christians, mainly in the church, is that commandment that we shouldn't make a graven image. But as you say, God, this one created by human hands. The science tells us it won't. But I mean, if even Moses was commanded by God to make a serpent in the wilderness and to lift it up as a sign, and Jesus actually quoted on that and said, "Just as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up." So I think it's kind of a sign, and it's not something people worship. I don't know anyone who worships the crowd. I don't even know a Catholic what bows down to it.
We had a conversation a couple weeks ago now, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, hard to remember. We have a lot of conversations with a lady by the name of Dr. Joy Pugh. And in the discussion, we got into a little bit of the shroud. Not intending to, it just kind of, the conversation drifted that way, which is really fascinating. But one of the things we were talking about was really DNA. And you can't really have that discussion without talking about conception. And one of the things that we know scientifically for a fact happens when the sperm enters the egg is there is a small explosion, right, that we can actually measure and we can see. And, you know, she postulates that more than likely that is when the soul and the spirit are actually entering into conception and creation. And it just seems to fit that when Christ was returned from Sheol to his body, you may have had that same explosive moment that would have produced that burst of radiation to cause what you see on the shroud.
Yeah, and I think it's funny how, Jesus says you must be born again. So I think, being born again is when we come to the resurrection. And I think that's what happened to Jesus. I think he was born again, born in a brand new body, and he got a spiritual body. And the Bible tells us that that's going to happen to us one day. All the believers will receive new bodies, and I suppose that's going to, I think it's going to be like being born again, but like there's sort of like a energy there what creates light with that transformation.
Yeah, and
I think that's what causes the Shroud of Turin.
And again, what we've been talking about this evening, I think it's a fascinating. Even if we put Christianity to one side completely, the topic is fascinating, and that encourages me all the more to be sharing that with everyone, really, because the whole story, all the mysteries, the fact that it's an unsolved mystery even now, it's a fascinating subject, and if we can parcel it up in such a way to make it attractive to a greater number. Again, I keep coming back to it. That would be. I think that would be our joint goal anyway. From the feeling I've got talking to you guys this evening, we share that same goal. We want to share the gospel out there, and find ways to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
Also, when we were talking to Joy Pugh, she said that she believes that the shroud is the Holy Grail. That's what she said. And so I thought that was fascinating. And that's what got us into the shroud, because it was like, can you elaborate a little bit? Yeah. And it makes sense. I mean, it did. The legend has it that it did heal people.
Yeah, we had all these conversations. The conversation with you guys well planned when we had that conversation. And we had no intention whatsoever of really getting into that at all with her. And it's just amazing how
you guys should talk to her.
Yeah, that conversation has now informed this conversation. But yeah, you guys would have fun with Joy.
Yeah.
Maybe we have another show and everybody gets together, because that would be a heck of a round table.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Holy Grail, what made it the Holy Grail was it contained the blood of Jesus. And that's what the shroud contains. It contains the blood of Jesus.
Yeah.
It's ingrained into the cloth, so you can't pick it up and use it. But it could have influenced the story of the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, guys, this has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. We appreciate you guys carving some late night out. I know it's almost pushing 11 o'clock there for you guys, so I'm not going to keep you up past your bedtimes anymore. Especially when we get older, we don't stay up as late. It's just not. So we just thank you guys so much for carving out some time and talking to us about this, and really appreciate it.
Thank you so much as well. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and let's hope it'll make a difference out there. That's what I hope. It'll make a difference.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've definitely enjoyed it. Thanks, guys. We've only touched the tip of the iceberg, but
we could do it again.
Yeah, part 2.
It's been brilliant.
Shroud part 2.
Yeah.
Now, again, just to kind of repeat, so everybody can get a hold of you guys, reach out, get some more information. Tony, we'll start with you. Please do go ahead and hold your website up there again for us. And for those that are only listening and not watching, I'll literally rattle off the letters. So if you want to get more information on Tony's booklet that he's got, which is really great, go to Tony, Tony-Cunliffe, Cunliffe.square.site. site, and you can find that out. And again, we'll link that for you guys in the description so that, you guys can click it easy and everybody can get to that. And if you want to check out Paul, which I would highly recommend you do, because one of the things we didn't touch upon today that I definitely want to just kind of end with, because it's phenomenal, because it takes all this and really puts it into humanity, is Paul has a ton of great visual information where we've taken the image on the shroud and he's computer modeled it and made it all 3-dimensional, and even videos and stuff. So you can literally see the image of Christ come alive right before your eyes, which just kind of gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. Or the image of this individual, who I would highly suggest is probably Christ. But again, with the thing that we've always said on this show is,
well, it looks like Christ.
It sure does. The thing we've always said on this show.
It amazes me that it actually looks like Jesus as well.
Yeah, right. You're right. Like what we would image Christ to look like. But again, the thing that we've always said on our show too, and Tony, you touched upon this, is, hey, we have our opinions. Obviously, that's fine. But for anybody out there that's not sure, this is all information. You can go dig into it yourself. Don't take our word for it, right? Dive into your Bible. Go read the end of the Gospels. Go see what happens with all the cloths, and then go do your own research on the shroud, and you can make up your own mind. So, but gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
All right. With that, we will bid you adieu until the next time on The Foil. Take care.
Bye.